Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of DataTechTalk. Today, we have a very special guest with us. Her name is Alexandra Moraru, and she's actually leading the software delivery components and functions in Cloudflare. Alex, it's super nice to have you here. How are you?
Thank you, Shana. It's very nice to be here as well. Looking forward for this conversation.
Awesome. So I would love to know, and I'm sure the audience as well, would love to know about your journey. So, you have been in supply chain industry for quite a number of years. You have led few different functions as well, with the likes of Forrester and DHL and so on. Could you explain to us a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, definitely. And when you invited me to join this chat, I thought about it a little bit more because recently I've been speaking a lot about my journey on what does it mean to be a software delivery manager. What does it mean to build a function on that, and what kind of skills do you need to acquire throughout your career to do that? So going back to it, I think that one of the important aspects of of my career journey, let's say, is the fact that I volunteered, for 5-6 years. And that because we volunteered for the same youth organization way back when we started, when we were students. And I think that shaped a lot of my curiosity around a lot of topics and enabled me to play around with various aspects of what does a professional do in order to be able to actually pick and choose not only what I'm enjoying, but also what I'm good at, right? So I did start working a lot in communication, which exposed me to the business side of things, understanding how to talk to customers, what do they care about, how do you make decisions in order to prove value to them, and then slowly moved into project program management. And you mentioned it already, so I worked in in supply chain for a large logistics company, DHL, for a few years, and I think this is when I actually realized my passion for improvements, for process improvement. So in a nutshell, I can say that what I care about is solving problems, making things easier, optimizing, making things more efficient. May that be in actual physical move of goods, which was the case in supply chain, or what I'm doing now more and more for the last few years in software delivery, right? So I transitioned to software delivery by moving from a more project management and operational improvements for supply chain, which was a very complex environment, by doing some work with a technology research company, which was Forrester Research, right? So actually, this is where I got curious and I learned much more about what do software companies do, what are their challenges, how can you overcome them. So I saw it a lot from the perspective of research and theory and what good looks like in the market. And then I realized, wait a minute, I want to be a practitioner. I want to get my hands dirty and actually do this. And while I didn't want to become an engineer, I did play around with the idea. I did some boot camps and learned to code in a couple of languages. And that was quite eye-opening because it helped me foster a better relationship with the engineers. But then I also realized, which is probably more important for the software delivery role, what are their challenges? So what kind of operational friction appears in different organizations? Because obviously you don't want to silo engineering as a function, but this is part of the value stream where you can provide value to your customers. Because ultimately the satisfaction from any job comes when you see your product in the hands of customers, maybe physical product or an app or a website or anything like that. So that's the journey that I took. And now I'm working with Cloudflare, as you mentioned, which is a company that ultimately wants to make the internet better. So we contribute to building this better internet. By creating security products that can help the users have a safe surfing of the internet and using the services provided within. So I hope that's a good overview of this whole journey and kind of what my thinking was moving through different aspects of business and industries.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Alex. You touched upon a very important thing, which is the challenges that different engineering functions and dev functions face while delivering a software product. Could you maybe give us a couple of examples from your professional, personal experiences, what you have seen as a challenge and how you managed to solve them? And were there any specific dimensions, let's say, the time to delivery or any other kinds of components that were key KPIs in these kind of
Mhm.
situations?
Yeah. And maybe what I will say will sound a little bit silly, because what I found in the last 2 years is that the hardest thing is not how do you actually technically approach the resolution of a problem. So how do you build things, but more on how do you communicate this back? How do you set the right expectations? How do you align with other teams that you might depend on or who might be depending on you? How do you translate your thinking back to more the business side of things, right? So there's a trend now in software delivery, which talks a lot about bridging this. I don't want to call it a gap, but bridging the business world, which will incorporate sales and marketing and products in all of those functions, and then the engineering side of things. What is platform? What is DevOps? What is engineering? What is front and back end, and all of that, right? And I think sometimes it's very easy to forget that the language that we have in engineering, we talk in story points and being agile, and
Yeah.
we talk about mean time to restore and safe deploys, and that doesn't mean anything to a CFO, for example, right? Like, what they want to know is, okay, do we have the right resources? What are our costs? What's our cost of opportunity, for example? So if we choose to do something, what else are we choosing not to do, right? Because we have finite time and resources. So bridging all of that communication probably is one of the bigger challenges that in general businesses see. But with software delivery becoming more and more important to any business, not just pure software companies, this communication is becoming normalized, right? So I think this is where the need of this kind of role of literally software delivery management comes in, because you must wear multiple hats. You must be able to speak these multiple, internal languages and translate these concepts from one group to another, as they obviously educate themselves and learn more about what everybody else does, right? And maybe a second piece or a second challenge that I could share is alignment on objectives.
Yeah.
And this is probably a very traditional, in a lot of much more mature companies in the space, or maybe startups that have been recently built, might not recognize this as an issue because they're super nimble and this is not a problem yet for them. Is alignment on these goals that they have. So what do you measure for yourself, right? You measure your engineering teams in a very different way than you measure and reward your sales teams, for example, right? And this brings me to a very funny anecdote, right? Because to illustrate this siloing of goals, I heard somebody say, and I'm sorry I can't quote them because I'd like to attribute them with this quote, but they went in and asked a team made up of different leaders in a company, and to ask them, look, think of a football game, right? And I'm not the best with sports, but I think that anybody can relate to that. What is the job of the goalkeeper?
Yeah.
And most people would say the job of the goalkeeper is to make sure that they don't let the ball go through the net, right? What is the job of the striker? The striker's job is to score a goal or something like this, right? But ultimately, the goal of every single person in the team is to win the game, right? And obviously they will all have different skills, but their ultimate goal is to win the game. And this is how our ultimate goal is to fulfill that mission that the company we choose to work in has, right? So the engineers' goals in Cloudflare, for example, is to make a better internet. The same for the salespeople, the same for the marketing people, right? So this is also a challenge in trying to translate. And connect back with, kind of the final KPIs, connect them back with the ultimate goal, right? So if you
Yeah.
take, for example, velocity or time to restore. I was talking about time to restore. So if
Mhm.
something happens in production after you make a deploy,
Mhm.
you need to have the ability to revert back to that version that was safe, that was okay, and then work on your bugs later, right?
Yeah.
So these are examples of metrics, but these need to be translated back into, what does this mean? What does this mean for our users? What does this mean for other people in the company who might not be able to quickly do part of their job because they are currently blocked by these kind of events, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Alex, very, very, nice insights on basically what kind of challenges you face. But I would love to know, because I've faced it before in my, previous roles, let's say, where there is a fundamental difference in understanding what a word even means. And I'll give you an example. What does the word blocked release mean, for example? Like, when do you not release a software? That is something that, the whole engineering team and the dev team needs to be aligned upon. And the product marketing team needs to know what the blocked release means and what's the effect of communicating something like that into different sort of stakeholders. What is your view on that? And how would you define, let's say, a blocked release?
Yeah. So I think in very easy terms, a blocked release in software is when, if you release it, something will go wrong because you're missing an important part of the information, right? So maybe you're missing an important part of the code or some aspect of the UI, for example. So I've had situations. So in my previous job, actually, because I was working a lot with product and design, we had a lot of blocked releases because the features that we were deploying were very well defined in the beginning. You had your requirements, your user stories, your definition of done, and all of that. However, it's important to acknowledge that while you develop, you will come up with other questions. You will come up with edge cases and with things. So sometimes you're blocked until your product manager says, actually, this is not a problem. Only 0.01% of the users might see a problem with this. So go ahead, release it. And if there's a lot of complaints, we'll manage. So that's not really a blocker. But you get a lot of questions, and actually a lot of questions from engineers whom you would think that maybe they're not very conservative, but it's interesting to see the kind of challenges they bring up and the angles that they look at problems from, which is very different from product management, for example, or from design, right? So coming back to blocked releases, it depends a lot on how you define it within the company and within the team that you're working with. Also for us, for example, in Cloudflare, obviously, if we know that anything we release might impact a specific amount of customers or a specific region, then definitely that's a blocker until we actually fix the problem. But many times I think we will be very conservative in what are we blocking and why? Because we're afraid of internal backlash or internal misunderstanding, right? Sometimes we block a release because maybe in some instances we're afraid to block on a Friday evening, to release on a Friday evening, because actually we don't want to cause problems to the people who are on call in the weekend. But actually
Yeah.
it's a fairly unhealthy mentality. We shouldn't be afraid of releasing. It's okay to release. Sometimes things break, but if you have a good process of fixing it, stopping the bleed and then fixing it for the longer term, then that's also fine. I don't think anybody expects perfectly written software, because if that were the case, we would never release anything.
Exactly. Well, that's a really nice insight. Thank you, Alex. And it gives a little bit more perspective and sheds a little bit more light on how, enterprise software companies deal with different kinds of, let's say, releases which are kind of continuous, because obviously you're releasing in a, more like a continuous delivery method. Um, So we'll move a little bit away from your current role, and I would love to understand a little bit more about your roles in different supply chain companies, especially Everledger. Everledger is actually, for those of you who don't know, it's a blockchain-based company, which is, you know, dealing with supply chain of, if I understand correctly, diamonds. Is that correct?
That's one of the assets
One of
that
the
they're
assets.
working with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how was your role there? How did you get into that kind of function? And, you know, what kind of, let's say, making it general, what kind of challenges you may face going forward in different kinds of supply chain industry?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting study case, Everledger, and I'm hoping that that they will actually get to see this and be happy that their story is seeping through different conversations, right? So I was working with them kind of in the early days of the company. I got there. I think because I was recommended by a former colleague from Forrester who is still working at Everledger, and I think the CEO took a leap of faith because I hadn't had a kind of direct experience really working with engineering teams. I told you that I was learning how, like, what is good case practice and what do we advise other companies to do in terms of software delivery. But then what I wanted to do is get my hands dirty. So remember from the beginning of the presentation, well, that was my transition into a proper software company. Was very small back then. It grew a lot in the meantime. And indeed, their objective is to provide provenance for high value assets, and by high value, I don't particularly mean just expensive, but also assets that are, important for different supply chains and for the world, like sustainably mined materials, right? Things that are important for the global commons, and for me, that's also high value as an asset. And I think one of the challenges that we saw there a lot, and it comes back to data, is the fact that in every supply chain, at least that we've looked at, the data is very fragmented, Shama. So you think of it as small pieces of production of an asset, let's say, that have nothing to do with each other. The only thing that they have to do with each other is when they transfer the asset from one format to the other, right? So you mentioned diamonds, so you'll have a mining company that will extract the material from the earth. Then you'll have to transport it to a facility that will turn the rough into a polished diamond. Then you will have to transport it to somewhere where they will distribute it. Then you will have to transport it to a jeweler who will make it, and then to a retail store, and then to a user, right? So all of these steps are very removed from each other, honestly, very removed from each other, because in between you'll have other actors that will actually store this data and this information. And actually what Everledger is trying to do is normalize it, is making sure that you can just track it back. So imagine you have a piece of jewelry with with a diamond or an emerald or something like that, and you want to know where it came from. However, right now you can't because the retailer never asked about this information. Where does this come from? Where was it processed? Who touched it? Is it really the piece of information before? And that's also because in the industry, nobody was asking this question. This is not needed to know in order to prove anything, right? So right now, I think, and you see this in a lot of supply chains, while this is still a problem, the data infrastructure and actually sharing the different data pieces, now we're trying to bridge, and there's a lot of companies who are trying to bridge this gap between the different systems that different actors will use, and try to find that common denominator from one step to the other, so that you can link back the journey of the asset. And this is ultimately a data problem, right? Because you never, this was never needed. Nobody cared about it before. But now, when there is this awakening on people who are actually questioning the sustainability of a lot of these assets, they want some confirmation that it went through the right compliance checks, that it went through the right practices and sustainable practices, going back to the mines. Do you use children to mine those minerals? Do you use slavery, for example? And all of these things are questions that are more important now than they were when the supply chain was established. So this is what ever-ledgering companies similar to them are doing at the end of the day. And then this is reflected in a lot of supply chains. So now you have a technology that can solve this problem. However, you have the big challenge that actually the supply chain is set up like it was 200 years ago. And there's a lot of catching up to do for each and every actor on this journey to be able to embrace that kind of technology that can now answer these questions from an end user perspective.
That was awesome. So I actually would love to know one last thing before we wrap it up today. What advice would you give someone who is actually interested in a lead delivery manager position, or someone who wants to, be that kind of a person that in the role that you are today?
I think one of the first things is to make sure you understand the role that you wanna take, because this position will be very, very different in a software company versus a company that is more focused on consulting or a product-led company, right? So I think it's important to understand what are the expectations, because delivery management is a very abstract term, and I've been I've been doing this job in various companies, and they were all called differently, right? So the titles can be different. So a lot of people assume that is similar to what they already know or what they were already doing. So don't assume. I think this is a good general life advice. Don't make any assumptions without having the right information. And then secondly, I was mentioning that I wanted to learn more about how the engineers I was working with are doing their day-to-day job. That doesn't mean you have to start coding and doing this as a living. However, it's important to understand the kind of challenges they have and also where do they find the satisfaction, right? So maybe do a boot camp if you can, or learn by yourself, because there's so many resources in which you can do self-paced learning, and you might even find a new passion, and I think maybe the third thing is learn how to manage uncertainty. I think this is one of the skills that I had to push myself to learn, because there's a lot of coziness in knowing exactly what you need to do, what's expected of you, and how to do it. But that's also fairly boring, let's face it. So managing uncertain situations will expand your breadth of skills much more. And I think that this specific skill is more important in a delivery management role, particularly because you get to work with various functions and people who will think of a problem or a situation very differently than you and most people around them. So what you need to do is embrace that uncertainty and then build a solution based on the information that you gather in the meantime. Yeah, I think these would be the three things that I would recommend to people. Don't make assumptions, educate yourself as much as you can, and manage uncertainty with an open mind.
Awesome. Alex, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a pleasure to have you. And, thank you for sharing all your experiences with us and your advice as well. Guys, if you're watching, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. We will have lots and lots of different kinds of data technology as well as software technology leaders coming on the show and talking about their experiences. So keep tuned. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Bye.